proceed with the lecture. So just like you guys, the bar exam has also been postponed. So naghintay din po ako ng 2 taon bago makapag-take ng bar nitong February 4 and 6. And gaya ninyo, alam ko na matagal yung pinaghandaan itong civil service examination. And I only hope na makadagdag ako dun sa confidence ninyo, kasi I'm sure na yung mga babanggitin ko ngayong gabi ay alam nyo na, nandyan na yan. So mas paiigtingin lang natin yung memorya nyo para dito, and para mas maalala nyo sila pagdating ng exam day. And kung meron man kayong mga bagay na ngayon pa lang malalaman, don't worry, kasi at least 'di ba, you still have time to read further and to know yung mga bagay na medyo feeling nyo hindi kayo confident. So tonight, let's start na agad since we only have until 9 p.m. for this lecture. So I want to cover as much as I could, so mas madami tayong matutunan and mas makapag-prepare tayo for the exam. Okay, so primarily ang i-cover natin tonight will be the Philippine Constitution, and I will also cover the salient features of RA 6713. So first off, for Constitution, let's first define what the Constitution is. So Constitution is a body of rules and maxims in accordance with which the powers of sovereignty are habitually exercised. So the Constitution that we have now is the 1987 Philippine Constitution. So constitutions, it may either be as written here, it may be written or unwritten, it may be rigid or flexible. Ours is written and rigid. Why written? Kasi we have the text, di ba? Nung 1987, the Filipino people itinatag ang 1987 Philippine Constitution. Meron tayong 18 articles. So yun yung dadaanan natin ngayong gabi, pero not the entire constitution kasi that would take a very long time. So dadaanan lang natin sila kung ano yung mga important features ng constitution. And rigid because it has to be complied with. The legislators, they base yung laws natin sa constitution, the policies. So yun yung tinitingnan natin, and anything na not in conformity with our constitution, it will be unconstitutional and hindi siya pwedeng i-enforce sa Pilipinas or sa kahit anong bayan since it is unconstitutional nga. That's how important the Constitution is, because the legality of the laws, the ordinances, the presidential issuances, lahat ng yung legalidad nun, lahat nakasalalay sa pagsunod sa 1987 Philippine Constitution. So it is a written instrument by which the fundamental powers of government are established, limited, and defined. So when we say fundamental powers of the government, dito nakikita natin under the Constitution, sineparate ang legislative branch of the government, ang executive branch, ang judicial branch of the government. And also nakalagay sa ating Constitution, and I will discuss this later, the three constitutional commissions. So we have the Civil Service Commission, the Commission on Elections, and Commission on Audit. So we will look into the Constitution, ano yung sinasabi niya tungkol sa composition ng bawat bodies na ito, ano yung scope ng kanilang powers, ano yung mandate nila. So pag nalaman natin ito, 'di ba? Yun yung titingnan natin kung tama ba yung mga pinapasa nilang batas, tama ba yung pinapasa nilang issuances, lahat nakabase yon sa Constitution. And then it is a written instrument by which these powers are distributed among several departments for their safe and useful exercise. So again, the Constitution is our basis for the legality of the actions of the government. So constitutional supremacy, this is a very basic doctrine and principle that we have, and it only means that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. As such, all laws must conform to the Constitution. So the Constitution, kung may hierarchy man tayo ng batas, number one dyan would be the Constitution. So all laws will follow what the Constitution says. So if a law or contract violates any norm of the Constitution, that law or contract, whether promulgated by the legislative or executive branch of the government or entered into by private persons for private purposes, is null and void and without any force and effect. What does it mean? So meaning, kunwari, I enter into a contract with somebody and it violates the Constitution. it won't be a valid contract. That won't be binding because the Constitution is deemed written in every statute and every contract. So we cannot go against the Constitution. That's what constitutional supremacy means. Okay, so let's go through the history of the Philippine Constitution. So the very first constitution that we had was the 1989 Malolos Constitution, followed by the 1935 Commonwealth Constitution, the 1973 Constitution, and the 1986 Freedom Constitution, and then the 1987 Philippine Constitution, which is the constitution that we have now. So ano yung nilagay ko dito na de jure and de facto government? So yung de jure, established by authority of the legitimate sovereign, and the de facto government naman, the de facto government naman established in defiance of the legitimate sovereign. By the way, please let me know kung masyadong mabilis yung pagsasalita ko so I can slow down for you guys, no? So yung de jure government, it means na established siya in accordance with the Constitution. So meron tayong amendment or revision. So but napapalitan natin yon, tas nasunod mo yung proper procedure, that's de jure. Pero de facto naman, when it is established in defiance of the legitimate sovereign. So nung EDSA revolution, that yung under the Freedom Constitution, what we had then was a de facto government, no, na nilegitimize natin as a de jure government by promulgating the 1987 Constitution. So the history of the history of the Philippine Constitution then, it reflects the history of the Filipino people. Kasi makikita nyo na from 1899 to 1987, yung political history ng Philippines ay na-i-record sa pamamagitan ng mga constitutions na nagmula pa nung Malolos hanggang sa 1987 Philippine Constitution that we have now. So let's discuss the parts of a constitution. So constitution of government. So this is what makes the constitution a constitution. So constitution of government. Ito yung provisions which set up government structures. And as I mentioned before, we have articles which define the three great branches of the government, the legislative, executive, and judicial. And of course, we also have articles 9 and 10, which pertains to the constitutional commissions and the LGUs, the local government units. So doon nako-constitute natin kung ano yung nagko-compose sa ating government structures. And then we also have Constitution of Liberty. These are the provisions which guarantee fundamental liberties against government abuse. So we have there, of course, the Bill of Rights. So an important thing to remember under Article 3 is that it can only be invoked against public officers. It can be invoked against the government. So if a private individual, for example, violates the fundamental liberties as stated in our Constitution, then the Bill of Rights will not be enforced against them. Pero we have the Civil Code of the Philippines which can be used against such private individual. And then third, we have Constitution of Sovereignty, provisions which outline the process by which the people may change the Constitution. As I mentioned before, we have amendments and revisions. So through amendment and revisions, we can change some parts of the Constitution, some provisions, or the essential aspects of the Constitution. So the Philippine Constitution that we have now, it starts with a preamble, followed by the 18 articles of the Constitution. So for our discussion tonight, I will talk more about the declaration, these articles, the Declaration of Principles and State Policies, the Bill of Rights, Citizenship, Suffrage, Branches of Government, Constitutional Commissions, Local Government, Accountability of Public Officers, National Economy, and Patrimony. So yung focus natin for tonight's discussion will be on these articles only. So let's start with the preamble. So ito, as you can see, binold ko na lang yung mga important part, no? So we, the sovereign Filipino people, it only means na sovereignty resides in the people and all government authority emanates from them. So yung function ng preamble natin, it lays down the origin, the scope, and purpose of the Constitution. So the Constitution, as we have stated earlier, di ba, it constitutes yung government structure natin, yung yung guarantees of fundamental liberties, and then of course yung Constitution of Sovereignty. And I guess it's also very important for us to remember nga na sovereignty resides in the people and all government authority emanates from them. So first article under the Constitution is the national territory. It's the article pertaining and defining the Philippine territory. It's very important to know because it, 'di ba, yung kung ano yung territorial jurisdiction ng government. Ano yung kino-cover ng Philippine government, yung nasa loob lang ng territory. So ito yung definition ng national territory natin, and you can just read this kasi it's very caudal. And then let's go to the Declaration of Principles and State Policies under Article 2 of the Constitution. So the Declaration of Principles and State Policies, this is a statement of basic ideological principles and policies that underlie the Constitution. These principles and state policies serve as a guide for legislation, implementation, and enforcement of our laws. So as we have stated before, yung government natin, it relies on the Constitution, kung ano ba yung legal, ano ba yung lawful. Nakadepende yon sa ating Constitution. So yung principles, these are binding rules which must be observed in the conduct of the government, and state policies, guidelines for the orientation of the state. So first, ito, Section 1, the Philippines is a democratic and republican state. Sovereignty resides in the people and all government authority emanates from them. So yun, it's also very important for us to note that the Philippines is a democratic and republican state. Section 2, the Philippines renounces war as an instrument of national policy. So adopts the generally accepted principles of international law as part of the law of the land and adheres to the policy of peace, equality, justice, freedom, cooperation, and amity with all nations. So the Philippines follows a policy against war, against war. So hindi tayo, parang the Philippines will always follow a defensive stance against war, pero yeah, it can only follow a defensive stance, but it cannot be aggressive with regard to yung war as an instrument of national policy. So the Philippines will always be defensive but not aggressive when it comes to war. Section 3, civilian authority is at all times supreme over the military. The armed forces of the Philippines is the protector of the people and the state. So this one, civilian authority, this is the reason why the armed forces of the Philippines is headed by the President of the Philippines. So today, for example, President Rodrigo Duterte as the Chief of Armed Forces of the Philippines, he is a civilian, di ba? Hindi siya part ng military, hindi siya nag-graduate sa PMA, but he heads the Armed Forces of the Philippines. So ito ay lesson natin from... Hello? Okay, let's continue. This is a lesson that we learned from the martial law era. So, yung nag-head ng ating armed forces ay dapat maging civilian lang because civilian supremacy is the principle that we adhere to under the 1987 Constitution. Section 4, Section 4 and 5 you can read on your own. Section 6, the separation of church and state shall be inviolable. So this is also a very basic principle that we adhere to here in the Philippines. So, 'di ba, madalas nating naririnig ngayon yung church and state dapat magkahiwalay, hindi dapat nakikialam ang church sa anumang yung ganap sa government. Pero it does not mean na the church is absolutely prohibited from speaking against the government or whatnot. It only states na hindi pwedeng makialam yung church or yung state sa affairs ng bawat institution na ito. Section 7, the state shall pursue an independent foreign policy. So we have an independent foreign policy. The Philippines, consistent with the national interest, adopts and pursues a policy of freedom from nuclear weapons in its territory. So I think these provisions I highlighted because of the current Ukraine-Russia issue. So it might be asked, but I think the exam will only ask the provisions um, regarding the state policies that we have here in the Philippines, if ever, no. Section 9, the state shall promote a just and dynamic social order through policies that provide adequate social services, promote full employment, a rising standard of living, and an improved quality of life for all. So this is also our state policy with regard to labor, 'di ba? The state has to promote full employment in accordance with the constitution. Section 10, the state shall promote social justice in all phases of national development. Section 11, the state values the dignity of every human person and guarantees full respect for human rights. And Section 12, the state recognizes the sanctity of family life. Section 13, the vital role of the youth in nation building. 14, of course, the state recognizes the role of women in nation building and shall ensure the fundamental equality before the law of women and men. That's why also this month, since we are celebrating Women's Month, we have laws which protect our women, such as Magna Carta of Women. We have the VAUSI, we have Safe Spaces Act. So these are all parts of the legislative's effort to comply with this state policy. Section 15, protection and promotion of the right to health of the people. Section 16, the state shall protect and advance the right of the people to a balanced and healthful ecology in accord with the rhythm and harmony of nature. So this provision, no, parang it's self-executory. What does it mean when it says na self-executory? It means that you don't need an implementing law. So unlike for example yung policy natin on full disclosure, kailangan merong kang dito subject to reasonable conditions prescribed by law under Section 28. For the right to a balanced and healthful ecology, you don't need an implementing law because that is self-executory. So just in case it be asked in the exam, um, self-executory provision means that you don't need an implementing law for you to assert your right over the said provision. Okay. Section, am I clear so far? If you have any questions, you can type your question and I will try to answer them at the end of the lecture. Thank you. And then Section 17, priority to education, science and technology, arts, culture, and sports to foster patriotism and nationalism. So since we have this under the Declaration of State Policies, the government will always strive to follow these state policies. So now we know that it is under the Constitution, which gives imprimatur to the government to give priority to education, science and technology, culture, and sports, etc. Section 18, also part of our state policies protecting labor. The state affirms labor as a primary social economic force. Section 19, the state shall develop a self-reliant and independent national economy effectively controlled by Filipinos. So this is also our Filipino first policy, no? And ano yung ibig sabihin ng Filipino first policy? We have provisions under the Constitution which require, for example, a certain percentage na dapat yung management ng isang for example, media, dapat naka-reserve siya sa Filipinos, ganyan. So meron tayong ganong provision na inuuna yung Filipinos over aliens. Aliens, hindi yung literal aliens, but aliens na non-Filipinos. So Section 20, the state recognizes the indispensable role of the private sector, of course. So the government has the duty to balance yung private sector and of course yung private enterprise and of course yung labor. For example, the government must always balance that kasi these are two competing interests, so it is the state which has to balance both sides. Section 21, the state shall promote comprehensive rural development and agrarian reform. So now we have laws, of course, pertaining to rural development and agrarian reform also. Section 22, rights of indigenous cultural communities. We have IPRA, for example, as our implementing law, which is with regard to this state policy. Section 23, the state shall encourage non-governmental community-based or sectoral organizations. 24, vital role of communication and information in nation building. 25, autonomy of local governments. We can see this state policy in action under the local government code. So the local government code that we have now, it runs under the basic principle that the local governments must have autonomy. So if you look at local government, the local government code, no, yung autonomy ng local governments now as compared to the autonomy that they had before, mas malawak na ngayon. So mas maraming magagawa yung local governments ngayon under our local government code. Section 26. The state shall guarantee equal access to opportunities for public service and prohibit political dynasties as may be defined by law. So, for example, this one also, you have to have an implementing law para ma-enforce natin yung state policy na ito. Section 27, the state shall maintain honesty and integrity in the public service and take positive and effective measures against graft and corruption. This one is very important with regard to the civil service examination that you will be taking this weekend, no? So bear in mind that it is our state policy under the Constitution that honesty and integrity must be maintained in the public service. That's why we also have RA 6713, for example, RA 3019. So these laws lay down the norms of conduct, of course, and the prohibited acts that govern the conduct of our officials in public service. And Section 28, finally, subject to reasonable conditions prescribed by law, the state adopts and implements a policy of full public disclosure of all its transactions involving public interest. And as stated earlier, you also have to have an implementing law to be able to enforce this state policy. Let's now go to Article 3 or the Bill of Rights. This is very important because it is the Bill of Rights which guarantee our fundamental freedoms as citizens of the Philippines. So the Bill of Rights governs the relationship between the individual and the state. So as I have stated before, you can only invoke the provisions under the Bill of Rights against a public official. You cannot invoke it against a private individual unless you invoke it under the provisions of the Civil Code. So the provisions in the Bill of Rights are self-executing. So as I mentioned before, since these provisions are self-executing, you don't need an implementing law for you to use these provisions against any governmental intrusion upon your fundamental rights. One's rights to life, liberty, and property, to free speech or free press, freedom of worship and assembly, and other fundamental rights may not be submitted to a vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. What does it mean? It means that your rights, our fundamental rights under the Bill of Rights, these are not subject to compromise, no? Parang you have that as a human being, you are entitled to it, and the government has the duty to protect and uphold it. So first, of course, this one is very important, very basic. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall any person be denied the equal protection of the laws. So under Section 1, Article 3 of the Constitution, two important concepts and doctrines, the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. Excuse me. The due process of law means simply that there shall be a law prescribed in harmony with the general powers of the legislative department of the government. And second, that this law be reasonable in its operation. Third, that it shall be enforced according to the regular methods of procedure prescribed. And fourth, that it shall be applicable alike to all the citizens of the state or to all of a class. So due process lang means that you will be heard before the state imposes a penalty, for example. So Due process means there's a hearing, and you go through the proper procedure before the state can impose the penalty accorded under the law. Second, the equal protection of the law. It means equality and not identity of rights. So, for example, if there is substantial difference between in your situation against another, and therefore you cannot invoke equal protection of law. The Constitution does not require that things which are different in fact be treated in law as though they were the same. So, our Constitution and our laws are very should be fair. So if they are different in fact, the law does not require that they be treated in law as if they were the same. The Equal Protection Clause does not forbid discrimination as to things that are different. It does not prohibit legislation which is limited either in the object to which it is directed or by the territory within which it is to operate. Okay, next provision, it states our rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. So this provision was very important, especially during the Tokhang period. But again, this is a very important provision against any unreasonable governmental intrusion against kasi it affects our fundamental right to privacy. So, as a general rule, searches and seizures are normally unreasonable. That's why it is a requirement that before a police officer searches or seizes personal property or even before a police officer arrests you, they must have with them a validly issued search warrant or warrant of arrest. And we have very specific requirements before one can procure a search warrant or warrant of arrest. No, so the very important requirement, of course, is probable cause determined personally by the judge. Next important provision under our Bill of Rights is stated under Section 4, which pertains to our freedom of speech and of expression. So no law shall be passed abridging the freedom of speech of expression or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. So what is the scope of our freedom of speech and of expression? So it covers written or spoken words, symbolic speech, pictures. So hindi lang siya limitado sa written or spoken words. Pwede din siya sa pagsusuot mo ng shirt na may kulay, 'di ba? Especially now na 'di ba meron tayong we have certain colors that we associate with certain people. Like for example, pink, we associate it with VP Lenny, red with BBM. So yung we have the right to wear whatever. For me, I'm wearing purple because it's Women's Month. But these are all part of our freedom of speech, which cannot be limited by a law. Of course, subject to certain very stringent exceptions. Motion pictures also. So for example, movies, when you create a movie, that is also covered by our freedom of speech and of expression. So ano ba yung laws na pinapasa that abridge the freedom of speech, of expression, or of the press? So we have prior restraint or censorship and subsequent punishment. Prior restraint, what does it mean? So prior restraint is, it is a law na sinisensor ka na even before you actually publish an article, for example. So pinagbabawalan na agad yung pag-publish mo, or hindi ka na makapagsulat, 'di ba? Hindi ka pa nakapagsulat, bawal na. As opposed to subsequent punishment na um, nagsulat ka na, nag-publish ka na, and then ipapunish ka. Ano yung itong restraints na to, however, 'di ba? Anong effect niya sa isang tao? May chilling effect. So for example, for us, if meron tayong prior restraint or subsequent punishment, matatakot ka kasing magsalita. Matatakot kang i-exercise yung freedom mo kahit karapatan mo naman. That is why we have this provision under our Bill of Rights, because it is our right to have freedom of speech, of expression, or of the press. So that is our right. And no law shall be passed which abridge such freedoms. Next is the right to form unions. So Section 8, the right of the people, including those employed in the public and private sectors, to form unions, associations, or societies for purposes not contrary to law shall not be abridged. So this one I highlighted this because in relation to the civil service exam, yung public employees natin, those in the public sectors, hindi sila pinagbabawalan to form unions, no? As I included here, all other employees of the civil service shall have the right to form associations for purposes not contrary to law. So we actually have also EO 180, which provides for the guidelines for the exercise of the right to organize of government employees creating a public sector labor management council and for other purposes. So under EO 180, 'di ba? The right to self-organization of those employed in the public sector is recognized. But 'di ba, yung right to form unions natin, as stated in the Constitution, it must not be for purposes na contrary to law. So yung right to form unions natin must only be for the furtherance and protection of their interests, not for the purposes of collective bargaining. Why why is it that it cannot be for purposes of collective bargaining? Because we have standardized the salaries for our public employees, 'di ba? So you cannot bargain with the government kasi. So when you bargain collectively with the management, for example, if you're an employee from the private sector, you can do that through your labor unions, no? But this is a limitation to the right to bargain, right to self-organization of public employees. So while you can form unions, while public employees can form unions, they cannot do so for purposes of collective bargaining. So what are the eminent under Section 9, this pertains to eminent domain. So Section 9 states that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. So this is eminent domain, one of the three great powers of the government. So ano yung requirements for the exercise of this power? It must be for public use. Just compensation must be given to the private owner. So in eminent domain, ang nangyayari lang dyan is that the government takes a private property for public use subject to the payment of just compensation. So public use ngayon, hindi naman siya literal na yung kalsada lang para magamit ng everyone. It does not require na all citizens must be benefited before it can be considered as for public use. So even yung housing natin, even if konting tao lang yung nakikinabang, it can still be considered as being being taken for public use. Taking naman, this is very technical, pero basically it means that the government will take the property and use it for whatever project na meron. So kung kunwari housing or road widening tapos natamaan yung property mo, the government has that power to take your private property and appropriate it, use it for public use kasi i-widen nila yung road and then pay yung just compensation. So ano yung just compensation naman? Yung determination of the amount to be paid to the owner of the land and payment of the and within a reasonable period of time from its taking. So yun, kailangan lang bayaran din ng gobyerno kung ano yung kukunin nilang private property from the owner of the property. That's eminent domain. And under Section 12, we have Miranda Rights. So ito naman yung naririnig na natin lagi. So ano ba yung kailangan sabihin sa taong inaaresto bago siya maaresto? So it is the police officer's duty to inform the person to be arrested of his or her rights under Section 12 of the Bill of Rights. So any person under investigation for the commission of an offense shall have the right to be informed of his right to remain silent. So you cannot be compelled to talk, 'di ba? Even if you're just under investigation, hindi ka pa formally charged sa isang korte, you have the right to remain silent and to have competent and independent counsel, preferably of his or her own choice. So you have that right to remain silent, right to a counsel. If the person cannot afford the services of counsel, he must be provided with one. So para saan yun? For the protection of his or her rights then. These rights cannot be waived except in writing and in the presence of counsel. And then no torture, force, violence, threat, intimidation, or in any other means which vitiate the free will shall be used against him. And what's important under this section also is that any confession or admission obtained in violation of this or Section 17 shall be inadmissible in evidence against him. For example, when a person is arrested and he or she was not informed of his or her right to remain silent, and to have competent and independent counsel, then any confession na nakuha nila from him or her, it cannot be admitted as in evidence against him or her. The law shall provide for penal and civil sanctions for violations of this section. Right to bail. It's 7:55. Is it okay if we stop here and have a 5-minute break so we can all go back at 8 p.m.?
Sure,
At
direct.
8 p.m. Thank
Sure,
you.
direct.
Have a break muna.
Yes po. VP Alexis.
Even to our participants as well po, you can have your restroom break or water break for 5 minutes. And also, while having our break, I would like to acknowledge Arsec Wilfred of JCI Zamboanga Inc. Good evening, Arsec.
Everyone, for those who want to grab a copy of the presentation, we will be sending it through your emails. That's why we require you to fill out the attendance link sent in the group chat. Thank you.
Ayan everyone, are we ready to continue with our lecture? Yes, hello. Type 1 charot, charot. Hindi, ito na, serious na ulit. Okay, so under Section 13, this pertains to the right to bail. So sa madaling sabi, piyansa. So bago ka makapag-apply para sa bail, para sa piyansa, custody is required before the court can act on an application for bail. So if you're not under custody, you cannot apply for bail, no? Except when bail is required to guarantee the appearance of a material witness. So bail is not limited to those who are in custody for a violation of a law, for example. So it can also be required to guarantee the appearance of a material witness. And Section 14, it pertains to the right to due process and criminal proceedings. So it is very important because, especially in criminal prosecutions, because the right to liberty is under consideration. So it's a fundamental right. So all the more that the right to due process must be observed by the government. Section 21, it pertains to the right against double jeopardy. So no person shall be twice put in jeopardy of punishment for the same offense. So that's Bill of Rights. So we now move to Article 4, which pertains to citizenship. So who are considered citizens of the Philippines? So the citizens of the Philippines are those who are citizens at the time of the adoption of this constitution in 1987. Those whose fathers or mothers are citizens of the Philippines, those born before January 17, 1973 of Filipino mothers who elect Philippine citizenship upon reaching the age of majority being 18. Those who are not naturalized in accordance with law. Natural born citizens naman, this is very important because there are certain, for example, when you run for the presidency, it is required that you must be a natural born citizen of the Philippines, diba, before you can run. So natural born citizens are those who are citizens of the Philippines from birth without having to perform any act to acquire or perfect their Philippine citizenship. It may be Philippine citizenship may be lost or reacquired in the manner provided by law. Ayan, citizenships of the citizens of the Philippines who marry aliens shall retain their citizenship. So under Section 5, it states here that dual allegiance of citizens is inimical to the national interest and shall be dealt with by law. So there is a difference between dual citizenship, which is allowed, but as compared to dual allegiance, which is not allowed, since it is stated in the Constitution inimical to the national interest, or hindi siya akma sa national interest. So this very classic case that we have, no, Senator Grace Polia Manzares. I don't know if she's an incumbent senator now, no. Pero Grace Polia Manzares was once a presidential candidate. Bakit siya inallowed to run as president? Because there's a case, Supreme Court decision, which states that a foundling is a natural born Filipino. So Grace Poe, being a foundling, she was allowed to run for the presidency. And Article 5, suffrage. So ito naman yung right to vote. Suffrage may be exercised by all citizens of the Philippines. So sino yung mga pwedeng bumoto, no? Sa darating na May 9, 2022. So you must be at least 18 years of age, who shall have resided in the Philippines for at least 1 year and in the place wherein they propose to vote for at least 6 months immediately preceding the election. No literacy, property, or other substantive requirements shall be imposed on the exercise of suffrage. So the right to vote, diba? Ito lang yung kailangan mo. You must be at least 18 years of age. At least pag 18 ka na, you have the right to vote. You can register. Pero kailangan may residency requirement in the Philippines for at least 1 year and kung saan ka boboto. So for example, me, I'm from Lingayen. Nag-reside dito naman ako nakatira all my life. Pero for example, lilipat ako sa Makati. Paglilipat ako doon, there's a residency requirement na I must have resided there for at least 6 months immediately preceding the election bago ako ma-allow to vote, to exercise the right to vote. Okay na to. Article 6, we now move to the three great branches of the government. We have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial department. So the first department na kino-cover ng ating constitution is stated under Article 6. It pertains to the legislative department or the Congress. So Section 1 states that legislative power shall be vested in the Congress of the Philippines, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. So meron tayong Senate and House of Representatives. The congressmen and women, sila yung nasa House of Representatives, and also our party list representatives. The senators naman are yung elected nationally. So sila buong Pilipinas yung magboboto sa kanila as opposed and as compared to the House of Representatives na binoboto according to their districts. So ano yung composition ng ating Senate? So we have 24 senators who shall be elected at large by the qualified voters of the Philippines. So as stated earlier, they are elected nationally. So yung term of office naman nila ay 6 years, and it shall commence unless otherwise provided by law at noon on the 30th day of June next following their election. So ito naman same for the president, the House of Representatives, and the Vice President. So lahat even for local officials, 'di ba? Magsa-start sila June 30. And no senator shall serve for more than 2 consecutive terms. Ano yung requirements for one to be able to run for Senate? So you must be a natural born citizen. You must be able to read and write, at least 35 years old on the day of the election, a registered voter, and a resident of the Philippines for at least 2 years immediately preceding the election. For the House of Representatives naman, ano yung requirements for you to become a district representative as opposed to a party list representative? Pero before that, the members of the House of Representatives shall be elected for a term of 3 years. So compared to a senator, na 6 years yung term nila, for members of House of Representatives, they only have a term of 3 years. No member of the House of Representatives shall serve for more than 3 consecutive terms. So as opposed to the senators, diba, na no senator shall serve for more than 2 consecutive terms, so they only have 2 consecutive terms. For House of Representatives naman, they shall only serve for 3 terms lang. They cannot serve for more than 3 consecutive terms. So what are the requirements for one to be able to run as a district representative? So you must be a natural born citizen, able to read and write, at least 25 years old on the day of the election, registered voter. This one is very important, diba? Before running for Congress as a district representative, you must be a registered voter in the district where he or she shall be elected. And then you must be a resident of the said district for at least 1 year immediately preceding the election. For party list representatives, we have a different set of requirements. You must be a natural born citizen, registered voter, resident of the Philippines for a period of not less than 1 year immediately preceding the day of the election, at least 25 years of age on the day of the election for the youth sector nominee. You must be at least 25 years old but not more than 30 years old on the day of the election. You must be able to read and write, and you must be a bona fide member of the party or organization which you seek to represent for at least 90 days before the day of the election. Okay, so for Article 7, it covers the executive department. And during the bar, this was the first question under political law. So yung question sa amin was that a 30-year-old charming mayor, 'di ba? Wants to run for the presidency. Can he or she run? Uh, so under the Constitution, 'di ba? If you look at the provision, the requirements for one to be able to run as president or vice president, you must be a natural born citizen of the Philippines, registered voter, able to read and write, at least or cannot run for the presidency because hindi niya na-meet yung age requirement under the Constitution, which must be at least 40 years old on the day of the election. He or she must be a resident of the Philippines for at least 10 years immediately preceding the election and has only a term of 6 years unless otherwise provided by law. Term of office commences same with the legislative department, no? Term of office commences at noon of June 30 next following the election. So for the president, he or she is eligible only for a single term. So wala kang re-election, no? Any person who has succeeded as president and served as much for more than 4 years shall not be qualified for election to the same office at any time. So, for example, yung nangyari kay President ex-President GMA before and ex-President ERAP, when yun yung kinakount natin dito. So, for example, para maka-run ulit si GMA noon, ito yung kinonsider nila, yung provision. Any person who has succeeded as president and served as such for more than 4 years shall not be qualified for election to the same office at any time. And Article 8, the Judicial Department. So yung kanina, 'di ba, legislative power is vested in the Congress. So yung Senate and House of Representatives. Pag executive department naman, nasa president. For the judicial department, the judicial power shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such lower courts as may be established by law. So the Supreme Court, ano yung composition ng ating Supreme Court? So the Supreme Court shall be composed of a Chief Justice and 14 Associate Justices. So that makes 15, di ba? Meron tayong 15 justices sa ating Supreme Court, 1 Chief Justice and 14 Associate Justices. It may sit en banc or in its discretion in division of 3, 5, or 7 members. So again, to emphasize, what are the 3 great branches of the government? We have the legislative. The legislative is in charge of legislating laws. So sila yung gagawa ng mga batas natin in accordance with the Constitution, of course. And the executive naman, sila yung nag-enforce, the implementing agency of the government. And third, the judicial, sila yung nag-interpret ng laws and the presidential issuances. If it confirms with the Constitution, the Judicial Department determines its compliance with the Constitution. So one important principle also is the principle of separation of powers, the checks and balances. Ito, we have 3 great branches, pero meron tayong certain provisions under the Constitution that ensure na meron tayong checks and balances. So for example, sa legislative, when they pass a law, we have a certain mechanism wherein the executive can check the acts of the legislative by giving the executive the president the veto power. So yeah, we have that principle under the Constitution. What are the fundamental powers of the state? So, kanina na-discuss natin yung eminent domain under Section 9. So, this is the taking of private property upon payment of just compensation. Pero ano yung 2 others? 2 fundamental powers of the state na it need not be conferred by the Constitution kasi it is inherent in the state. So, fundamental power talaga siya ng state. So, the police power, which requires that there be a lawful subject and lawful means. So, and then the taxation, which is the greatest power nga daw among the 3. So, property is taken for the support of the government. So, the 3 fundamental powers of the state, again, the police power, taxation, and eminent domain. Article 9 naman, it pertains to our constitutional commission. So as I mentioned earlier, we have three constitutional commissions, which shall be independent. So these are Civil Service Commission, the Commission on Elections, and the Commission on Audit. For Civil Service Commission, this shall be administered by the Civil Service Commission, no, composed of a chairman and two commissioners who shall be natural-born citizens also of the Philippines and at the time of their appointment at least 35 years of age with proven capacity for public administration and must not have been candidates for any elective position in the elections immediately preceding their appointment. So ito yung composition ng ating Civil Service Commission. We have a chairman and two commissioners who shall be appointed by the president with the consent of the commission on appointments for a term of 7 years without the appointment. The scope of the Civil Service Commission, no, the civil service embraces all branches, subdivisions, instrumentalities, and agencies of the government, including GOCCs with original charters. So, appointments in the civil service shall be made only according to merit and fitness to be determined as far as practicable. So, itong civil service exam, this is a part of this constitutional provision. So, appointments shall be made. So, meron tayong merit and fitness test, di ba? So, itong civil service exam, it's a part of the implementation of this constitutional provision. No officer or employee of the civil service shall be removed or suspended except for any cause provided by law. No officer or employee in the civil service shall engage directly or indirectly in any electioneering or partisan political campaign. This is the reason why our employees in the civil service cannot campaign, 'di ba, for purposes of election. So kapag nasa serbisyo ka, you must be non-partisan. The right to self-organization shall not be denied to government employees. So as stated earlier, you have the right to self-organize, except that you cannot exercise the right to collective bargaining because as stated nga, we have a standardized salary. The salary of our employees in the government has already been standardized. So you cannot bargain with the government. That is why the right to self-organization is limited to for to purposes of mutual protection lang, ganun. And right to form unions, you are not denied that right because you have the right to self-organization. And then, temporary employees of the government shall be given such protection as may be provided by law. So, even if you are a temporary employee, you are still entitled to protection. What is the mandate of the Civil Service Commission? Very important also. Civil Service Commission is the central personnel agency of the government. So sila yung HR ng ating gobyerno. The CSC shall establish a career service and adopt measures to promote morale, efficiency, integrity, responsiveness, progressiveness, and courtesy in the civil service. So it shall strengthen the merit and reward system, integrate all human resources development programs for all levels and ranks, and institutionalize a management climate conducive to public accountability. Later, I'll discuss then, diba, how important the Civil Service Commission is, ano yung role nila, because at the end of the day, public office is a public trust, and yung mandate na ito nakaangkla doon sa prinsipyong yun. It shall submit to the President and the Congress an annual report on its personnel programs. The second constitutional commission under Article 9 is the Commission on Elections. Commission on Elections, ito yung mandate nila. So they shall exercise the following powers and functions. So basically more on election sila. So kaya ngayon, 'di ba, we hear a lot of news about COMELEC kasi it's election period na for national, 'di ba? So enforce and administer all laws and regulations relative to the conduct of an election, plebiscite, initiative, referendum, and recall. So ito naman, exclusive original jurisdiction over all contests relating to the elections, returns, and qualifications of all elective regional, provincial, and city officials, and appellate jurisdiction over all contests involving elective municipal officials decided by trial courts of general jurisdiction or involving elective barangay officials decided by trial courts of limited jurisdiction. Medyo technical na yung part na yan. So feeling ko naman. But it's good to know, diba, that they exercise exclusive original jurisdiction over all contests relating to elections, returns, and qualifications, ERQ. Okay. Decisions, final orders, or rulings of the Commission on election contests involving elective municipal and barangay offices shall be final, executory, not appealable. Decide except those involving the right to vote all questions affecting elections, including determination of the number and location of polling places, appointment of election officials and inspectors, and registration of voters. That is why the COMELEC also has been very active during this period, even before the start of the campaign period, because they are mandated to oversee and to decide then matters relating to number and location of polling places, appointment of election officials, and registration of voters. So sila yung nag-oversee and sagawa ng registration of voters because that is their constitutional mandate. Mahaba na siya. Pero this one, very codal and very technical din. But very important is that the COMELEC has the power to deputize law enforcement agencies and instrumentalities of the government. They can tap the armed forces of the Philippines for the exclusive purpose of ensuring free, orderly, honest, peaceful, and credible elections. So, ayun, kaya during election period, di ba, we can see the COMELEC in partnership with AFP, for example, kasi they are constitutionally mandated to ensure free, orderly, honest, peaceful, and credible elections. They are also mandated to register political parties, organizations, or coalitions, which, in addition to other requirements, must present their platform or program of government and accredit citizens' arms of the COMELEC. So this is also part of the mandate of the COMELEC. Financial contributions from foreign governments and their agencies to political parties, organizations, coalitions, or candidates related to elections constitute interference in national affairs, and when accepted shall be an additional ground for cancellation of their registration with the Commission. Okay, this one also is very file upon a verified complaint or on its own initiative petitions in court for inclusion or exclusion of voters. So the COMELEC can file petitions in court for the inclusion or exclusion of voters. Ibig sabihin, ipapa-include mo ba itong voter na ito sa list of registered voters or ipapa-exclude mo? The COMELEC has that constitutional mandate. They can also investigate and prosecute cases of violations of election laws, including acts or omissions constituting election frauds, offenses, and malpractices. For example, vote buying. They can also recommend to the Congress effective measures to minimize election spending, including limitation of places where propaganda materials shall be posted, and to prevent and penalize all forms of election frauds, offenses, malpractices, and nuisance candidates. That's why then, diba, the COMELEC has that constitutional mandate that na before, diba, trinim down natin yung mga nag-file ng kanilang COC. And they were the constitutionally mandated commission na mag-trim down nung list na yon to exclude the nuisance candidates. And ito din, that's why also yung issue ngayon, yung sa Oplan Baklas na under TRO, if I am not mistaken ngayon, it is the COMELEC which is also constitutionally mandated to recommend effective measures to and limit yung places where propaganda materials shall be posted. So, diba, sila yung nag-i-issue ng regulations pertaining to the posting of tarpaulins, for example, of candidates. Number 8, recommend to the President the removal of any officer or employee it has deputized or the imposition of any other disciplinary action for violation of or disregard of or disobedience to its directive, order, or decision. So this gives to the earlier mandate of the COMELEC, diba, na they can tap any governmental agency to ensure yung free, honest, orderly, peaceful election for Any disobedience to such directive, order, or decision, the COMELEC can recommend to the President the removal of such officer or employee that it has deputized. And ninth, submit to the President and the Congress a comprehensive report on the conduct of each election, plebiscite, initiative, referendum, or recall. Commission on Audit. The COA shall have the power, authority, and duty to examine, audit, and settle all accounts pertaining to the revenue and receipts of, and expenditures or uses of funds and property owned or held in trust by or pertaining to the government or any of its subdivisions, agencies, or instrumentalities. That is why, diba, it is also COA which has the power to, or the commission, the body constitutionally mandated to examine um finances ng ating government. So for example, kaya sila yung nagbibigay nung highest rating, for example, ng isang government agency when it comes to the use and the expenditures of public funds and property. So it is COA, which is constitutionally mandated to do so. The Commission shall have the exclusive authority to define the scope of its audit and examination, establish the techniques and methods required therefore, and promulgate accounting and auditing rules and regulations, including those for the prevention and disallowance of irregular, unnecessary, excessive, extravagant, or unconscionable expenditures or uses of government funds and properties. So, si COA yung magde-determine kung tama ba yung kung paano ba hinahandle ng bawat government body or agency yung pondo ng taong bayan, kung napupunta ba siya sa tama, kung overpriced ba yung projects. The COA has that constitutional mandate to monitor, to make sure na yung pondo ng gobyerno napupunta sa tama. Article 10, it pertains to our local governments, and also we have the local government code, no? So when we read it, let's read it together, no? Yung local government provision under the Constitution and the local government code. So the territorial and political subdivisions of the Republic of the Philippines, what are these? The provinces, cities, municipalities, and barangays. They enjoy local autonomy in consonance with the earlier stated uh, state policy na yung local governments natin shall enjoy autonomy. So under the local government code, local government units are given greater autonomy now. No? Each local government unit shall have the power to create its own sources of revenues and to levy taxes, fees, and charges. That is why barangays, for example, our barangays can levy yung para sa mga sari-sari store, for example, that is part of this constitutional provision which gives each local government unit the power to create its own sources of revenues and to levy taxes, fees, and charges. But of course, subject to such guidelines and limitations as the Congress may provide, consistent with the basic policy of local autonomy. So, again, yung kunwari, meron tayong may pinasa sa local government units na ordinance or anything na, 'di ba, na nagle-levy ng tax, fee, or charge, it must always be in conformity not only with the Constitution but also with the law na ipe-prescribe ng Congress, because that is what the Constitution states, 'di ba? Subject to such guidelines and limitations as the Congress may provide. And then next, local government units shall have a just share as determined by law in the national taxes, which shall be automatically released to them. This is yung IRA, income revenue allotment. So that is also stated in our Constitution, and that's why we have it. That's why merong ganyan na nangyayari. May nire-release na ganyan because that's a provision under the Constitution. Article 11, this one very important, accountability of public officers. So ito yung sasabi ko kanina, public office is a public trust. So public officers and employees must at all times be accountable to the people serve them with utmost responsibility, integrity, loyalty, and efficiency, act with patriotism and justice, and lead modest lives. So ito yung mga expectations. Not only expectations, pero constitutional requirements for a public officer and a public employee. So you must serve the people with utmost responsibility, integrity, loyalty, and efficiency, which these words also, same words, we can see under relevant laws such as RA 6713. Yung mga implementing laws natin like that, and then RA 3019. Ito yung mga laws na nag-enforce nitong constitutional provision na ito. And then Section 2, the President, Vice President, members of the Supreme Court, members of the CONCOM, yung CSC, COA, and COMELEC, and the Ombudsman may be removed from office on impeachment. So ito yung mga impeachable officers natin. President, VP, members of the Supreme Court, members of the CONCOM, and the Ombudsman are our impeachable officers, no? For and conviction of culpable violation of it. These are the grounds for impeachment: culpable violation of the Constitution, treason, bribery, graft and corruption, other high crimes, or betrayal of public trust. All other public officers and employees may be removed from office as provided by law, but not by impeachment. So, these impeachable officers, ito ay exclusive list. This is an exclusive list, and therefore, only these officers can be impeached. Kasi yung impeachment process natin is very rigid and strict. So all other public officers, if you are not the President, VP, you're not a member of the Supreme Court, not a member of the CONCOM, not the Ombudsman, you may be removed from office as provided by law, no, not by impeachment. The House of Representatives shall have the exclusive power to initiate all cases of impeachment. So to initiate an impeachment complaint, dapat manggaling yung complaint from the articles of impeachment from the House of Representatives. The present anti-graft court, known as the Sandigan Bayan, shall continue to function and exercise its jurisdiction as now or hereafter may be provided by law. So yung Sandigan Bayan natin, 'di ba, has a very specific jurisdiction na very technical also, pero the Sandigan Bayan is the present anti-graft court na handle ng cases involving public officers. So what's the main point under Article 11? Public office is a public trust, and the public officers and employees must at all times be accountable to the people, serve them with utmost responsibility, integrity, loyalty, and efficiency, and act with patriotism and justice, and lead modest lives. So very quickly, ano yung norms of conduct of public officials and employees? So meron as stated nga kanina, and this is under RA 6713. So there must be commitment to public interest, professionalism, justness and integrity, political neutrality because we must be non-partisan, responsiveness to the public, nationalism and patriotism, commitment to democracy and simple living. So, 'di ba, as public officials and employees, these are norms of conduct that you must embody because and pag mapapansin nyo, it really is for the people because as a public official and a public employee, you are serving the people. That is why itong norms of conduct na ito is imperative for and required for all public officials and employees. What are the duties of public officials and employees, no? So basically, itong sinasabi nila, you must act promptly, expeditiously. Dapat mabilis yung proseso sa gobyerno, hindi mabagal. That is why meron provisions under the law which provide for specific number of working days kung gaano kabilis dapat ang pag-respond to this one, within 15 working days from receipt thereof, respond to letters, telegrams, or other means of communication sent by the public. Itong other one, 45 days naman, yung pag-submit ng performance report of the agency or office or corporation concerned. So these provisions require public officials and employees to act promptly and expeditiously when it comes to matters involving the government and the public in general. All public officials and employees must attend to anyone who wants to avail himself of the services of their office or of their offices, and must at all times act promptly and expeditiously. So you cannot choose people na isa-serve nyo, di ba? You must serve everyone. Since you are serving the people, you must serve anyone who needs your service. And as public official and employee, that is your duty to the public. All public documents must be made accessible to and readily available for inspection by the public within reasonable working hours. This is, of course, for transparency also and accountability of our public officials and employees. What are the prohibited acts under RA 3019 and 36713? Public officials and employees shall not directly or indirectly have any financial or material interest in any transaction requiring the approval of their office. So kasi we are trying to avoid a situation where there will be a conflict of interest. Um, you cannot also own, control, manage, or accept employment as officer, employee, consultant, counsel, broker, agent, trustee, or nominee in any private enterprise regulated, supervised, or licensed by their office unless expressly allowed by law. So again, it's a conflict of interest situation that this provision is trying to avoid. You are not allowed to engage in the private practice of their profession unless authorized by the Constitution or the law, provided that such practice will not conflict or tend to conflict with their official functions. So, for example, uh, a a member of COMELEC, for example, you cannot engage in the private practice of law unless you are authorized by the Constitution or the law. Or yun, meron kang authority to practice. Because again, we are trying to avoid the situation wherein there will be a conflict of interest. Next, public officials and employees shall not use or divulge confidential or classified information officially known to them by reason of their office and not made available to the public. Of course, you have the duty to protect classified information na nalaman nyo because of your office. And without your office, you would not have known such confidential or classified information. You are also not allowed to persuade, induce, or influence another public officer to violate the law, violate rules and regulations duly promulgated by competent authority, or an offense in connection with the official duties of the latter. Diba? Kasi as public officials, you must support the Constitution, obey the laws, then and you are not allowed to persuade, induce, or influence another public officer to violate rules and regulations. And then this one also very common when it comes to offenses of public officials and employees. You cannot cause any undue injury to any party, including the government, or giving any private party any unwarranted benefits, advantage, or preference in the discharge of his official, administrative, or judicial functions through manifest partiality. Manifest partiality meaning um you favor the person with, 'di ba? Obviously you are obviously favoring the person. Evident bad faith or gross inexcusable negligence. This provision shall apply to officers and employees of offices or governments, corporations charged with the grant of licenses or permits or other concessions. So for example, sa issuance of licenses or permits, no, we have a certain list of requirements that must be complied with. And if the public official shows manifest partiality, evident bad faith, or gross inexcusable negligence in the issuance of such license or permit, he or she may be liable under this provision. You are also knowingly approving or granting any license, permit, privilege, or benefit in favor of any person not qualified or not legally entitled to such license. So as I stated earlier, we have a set of requirements, 'di ba? For one, before one can acquire a license, permit, or privilege or benefit. Pero when you knowingly approve or grant such license, knowing that the other person is not qualified for or not legally entitled to such license, permit, privilege, or advantage, or of a mere representative or dummy of one who is not so qualified or entitled, then that is a prohibited act under the law. Public officials and employees shall not solicit or accept directly or indirectly any gift, gratuity, favor, entertainment. So, you cannot parang it's a part of the implementation of the integrity in your office. So as a public official and a public employee, you are not allowed to solicit or accept directly or indirectly any gift. So what is a gift? A gift refers to a thing or a right disposed of gratuitously or any act of liberality or in favor of another who accepts it. So it shall not include an unsolicited gift of nominal or insignificant value not given in anticipation of or in exchange for a favor from a public official or employee. So not all kinds of gift naman ay prohibited act na yung accepting for example yung gift of nominal or insignificant value and not given in anticipation of or in exchange for a favor from a public official or employee, that may not be considered as a prohibited act, no? What does it mean when a public officer or public employee receives a gift? It includes the act of accepting a gift from a person other than a member of his family or relative, even on the occasion of a family celebration or national festivity like Christmas, if the value of the gift is neither nominal nor insignificant, or the gift is given in anticipation of or in exchange for a favor. So for example, may nagregalo sa inyo and bongga, like 'di ba, parang nagbigay siya ng luxury car sa isang public officer or public employee, um that is considered as receiving a gift kasi that is neither nominal nor insignificant. And in both RA 30, please take note nga din na in both RA 3019 and 6713, the commission of prohibited acts is subject to the penalties of fine, suspension, or both, or removal depending on the gravity of the offense. So, as a public officer and employee, you are pwede kang masubject to three types of liabilities. So you may be subject to civil liability, administrative liability, or criminal liability. So aside from RA 3019 and 6713, the revised penal code also punishes direct or indirect bribery din. So that falls under yung criminal liability ng isang public officer and employee when you accept gifts, for example, 'di ba? In exchange for a favor eh, na related to your office. So next naman ay ang ating statement of assets, liabilities, and net worth. All public officials and employees shall file under oath their SALN, ito yung SALN natin, and the disclosure of business interests and financial connections, and those of their spouses and unmarried children under 18 years of age living in their household. So if you're a public official or employee, you're required to file under oath your SALN and disclosure of business interests and financial connections, except sino yung mga hindi required to file SALN. Those who serve in an honorary capacity, laborers, casual, or temporary workers, they are not required to file their SALN. So ano yung yung dapat nating i-declare sa ating SALN? So real property, its improvements, acquisition costs, assessed value, and current fair market value. Personal property and acquisition cost, all other assets, cash on hand or in bank, stocks, bonds, and the like, liabilities, and all business interests and financial connections. When to file your SALN? So within 30 days after assumption of office, on or before April 30 of every year thereafter, and within 30 days after separation from the service. Other notes, relatives in the government and their identification must be disclosed, and the SALN must be available for inspection at any reasonable time. And since Thank you. So that is my lecture covering yung Philippine Constitution, RA 6713 and RA 30